Hello, this is Greg from Art Can Help. I'm continuing a series on my class Basic Design um, to further emphasize what happens in a design course, why it's very hard to replicate in non traditional educational settings. And we're on day three. The question is, what happens on day three? It's pretty simple. Day three is our first critiques. They've had homework over the weekend and they had to generate a bunch of things. So if you think back to the creative process that I was talking about, that I was heavily influenced from IDEO, I'm trying to walk students through a very basic process of how they get better at exploring, refining their work, critiquing their work, and analyzing their work. So they have to make 90 thumbnails. They've given this black and white squares. It's a very straightforward, simple project, but it has a lot of options and it can be quite challenging. So they have to come up with 15 different compositions for different ideas. One of those is order, one is bold, one is happy, congested, and so on. And using just 4 black squares, they need to make 15 ideas as to how to communicate or respond to these ideas. So they've done this. They've come in with all of these things, and we put them up on the wall, and we begin a critique. And so I like to start with baby steps for a couple of reasons. Several of these students have never been in a critique setting. They don't understand, like, what are we doing? On top of that, it's great for art majors to have a refresher on the basics of why do we do what we're doing? What exactly are we trying to get at? And what is helpful feedback and how do we gauge that? And so the critique itself is very simple. They have these 90 thumbnails all on the wall for each student, and I want them to go through and I tell them for each idea of the collection of 15 for each student, you're going to look at all of them, and then you're going to put a little tick mark under the one that you think is the best. And I tell them beforehand, I'm being very vague on purpose. I am just saying best. You need to determine what you think best means. There's lots of reasons. Some of the reasons you might say are like manipulative teaching techniques, maybe, but also the fact is like when people engage with visual communication anywhere in the world, whether it's works of art or graphic design or whatever, they are largely responding from what they like. And what they like is defined by them. So I'm not going to define what the best thing is because that's the point of the critique. So they go through, they put all these tick marks, and then I ask the question, so what do those tick marks mean? What do you get from it? And always, a very nice, optimistic student will say something like, that's the best one. I look at what I've received, and this one got 9 or 10 ratings on it, and so that's the best one, and I should move forward with that one because inevitably they're going to be whittling this down. They're going to cut all the bad ideas. They're going to move forward in the next step with just 2 ideas from each of the set of 6, and that's nice. That's a good way to respond, and I'm happy that especially at this college that's what my general response is. It's very hopeful and it puts a lot of faith in humanity. But then, of course, I always follow up and I say, but what if this audience that you're working with, what if they're all fools? Which obviously they're not, but some of them might be. Who knows? I don't know them yet. And it's like, just because these people said that's what they like, what does that tell you? This isn't representative of the entire world, obviously. And so we have this conversation back and forth. What are we doing when we critique? So not only am I trying to ease people in who haven't had familiarity with this process, I'm also trying to help them understand the value of their opinions. Because for some reason, these students in particular don't understand that having an opinion is like what makes you human. You ask them, what do you like between A and B? And they're like, I don't know. They're very apathetic. They don't care. And which is really sad to me. That means they've got an opportunity to care about something. That doesn't mean they have to give an arm and a leg for it. It just means that to have an opinion is to be a human being. And that the more we understand each other's opinions, the more interesting we can be in how we work and how we interact with others. So the very basics of this critique is getting people to understand the value of their opinion and how do they make that decision. So we walk through what are the different strategies? How do you define best? Some people are like, I thought that the best idea for increase was a left to right movement of boxes growing in scale. And so whenever I saw that, that's the one I rated. And then of course the question is, yeah, after you saw like everyone did that and you saw that it gets kind of boring, did it start to change? Did you start to think, now that I've seen 20 of these, maybe I want an increase that like changes it up a bit? You have people saying like, I looked for the ones that I thought were the most unique. And that's great, except for the fact that after you look at, if there's 10 students, we've got 900 thumbnails. And if there's around 20 students, which are my classes, that means there's 1,800 thumbnails they're looking at. The notion that there's very many unique ideas, especially coming from college age students, like maybe there's one unique idea per semester that I do this. Like I've seen thousands of these by now, thousands and thousands. And you see all the same ideas. Happy, everyone does some version of a Minecraft smiley face. Because again, they've only got 4 squares. So it's a crappy smiley face. And it's like, I understand why your mind went there. That's part of the exploration process, is how do we find new ideas? Well, we need to inevitably get our cliches out. We need to see them. We need to process through them and work forward. So then we have more conversations. What does it mean, when someone has a cluster where they got one of their thumbnails got 9, but what happens when they've got a spread? What happens when they've got, 6 that all have 3 votes? It's like, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean they have 6 good ideas, in which case the audience was torn between the quality, we got all high quality in this one batch? Or does that actually mean you have no good ideas and everyone was kind of looking at some garbage? What about the one that got all of the votes, a 9? Does that mean it's a good one? Or does that actually just mean it's good within the context of your other bad ideas? What if it's the best bad idea present rather than actually being good? And so we talk through this. We get different senses as to what do some students value. Some students value problem solving. Some students would say, I like the ones with the cleanest lines. So the ones that were drawn the best. It's like, oh man, like if we didn't know that, then, when someone says, I like this one the most, it really is meaningless without the nuance, without the context of what they're saying. Then we talk about the context of our critique wall and the fact that we're looking at 1-inch thumbnails, and because it's a cluster of students, I have them spread out, but inevitably they're all up there. They're getting antsy after this takes about 30 to 40 minutes to just do the tally mark part. They're quietly doing this, awkwardly, like teenagers, like college students trying to, jostle around and whatnot. And inevitably they get tired or they're worried about someone else. So they go fast, they make a decision fast. It's like, hey, what if half the votes were just people not really looking? They were seeing that 5 people voted for this one, so what's another? It's a shortcut, like democratic voting systems. So there's so many ways in which just getting a thumbs up, so to speak, a like, is not that helpful. It certainly doesn't tell us what we did correctly. It certainly doesn't tell us how we can replicate that. And it must all be held within a context. On top of that, the context of the wall, again, it's like Sharpie looks really good because it's so dark and bold. And some of you guys use really fine like pen, and it's a really nuanced, delicate little thing, but it's a 1-inch square on a massive wall filled with thumbnails. No one sees that little delicate thing. It's like, how do we work with this? What do we do? And so then the question comes to the students, and we're going to continue this conversation through the next few days of how do you deal with the fact that so much of this class is a competition for attention, like life. When you're designing and trying to get human beings' attention, you're competing in the field of our vision to draw us in. And what can we do to further set ourselves up? How do we contextualize our work so that people will see it? And that's what this first critique is simply that, trying to get at why do we talk to each other about this stuff? And what are we trying to get at? How do we strategize new ideas for how to contextualize, how to contrast, how to harmonize, how to unify with our environment so people can look? So that's the first half of class. And then, they're very tired. They're very frustrated that this wasn't a simple, straightforward thing. They want they want it to be like a Scantron test, even though, my God, trust me, you do not want a design class to be like a Scantron test. And then we move into something else. At the same time in my course, again, I lean heavily on the design that Alyssa Aronson passed down to me. We begin a project that is I intersperse with this black and white squares, because the black and white squares project is going to continue on in different variations starting next class. But I start to get tired of seeing black and white squares. And though it is a very good tool to teach students these basics, it's taxing on me to see these squares so frequently, because I think this is something like the 40th or 45th time I've taught this class. And so I haven't seen a more valuable way to get at all of these basics in as fast and complex a way that is manageable and students can take it bit by bit. But I've got to see some other stuff. I need a break. Come the middle of next week, I need a break from squares. And so I start them on what I call a single drawing. I assign them this semester. I've assigned them interesting insects, and they need to make a drawing of that insect. And I like to read something from George Saunders. If you've seen my other videos, I reference this regularly. I'm calling it the Parable of Stan these days. But I like to read this as sort of a conversation starter, but also like a contrast, because we've already defined design as something that is working towards a predefined goal or a predefined intention. And Saunders pushes against that with his definition of what he thinks the creative practice is and how we make art. For those who don't know George Saunders' work, he is a creative writer. He's an author. He's very well known for short stories. He has written a novel, but he's mostly known for his short stories. So when he talks about art, he means it very broadly, which is why I like him, if you know me. So let me get started with this. My screen is over here and I'm reading this, so I apologize for not having a nice gaze into the camera. We often discuss art this way. The artist had something he wanted to express, and then he just, expressed it. That is, we buy into some version of the intentional fallacy, the notion that art is about having a clear-cut intention and then confidently executing the same, which I want to interrupt for a moment and highlight that that's what I'm talking about with design. Design is oftentimes you have a clear-cut intention and then, you just finish it. You just do it. And this is where like the cliche ideas come from. The students have this intention of making a happy little composition with 4 squares. And what's the idea that pops into their mind? A happy face. And they make the happy face. And that's where like really unoriginal ideas come from that process. So that is one way that human beings create things. And generally what it produces are not very interesting. It produces cliches. And cliches have their place, but they're not going to be groundbreaking. They're not going to define the medium in some new way. So, but let me get back to Saunders. Saunders continues. The actual process, in my experience, is much more mysterious and beautiful and more of a pain in the ass to discuss truthfully. A guy, Stan, constructs a model railroad town in his basement. Stan acquires a small hobo, places him under a plastic railroad bridge near that fake campfire, then notices that he's arranged his hobo in a certain posture. The hobo seems to be gazing back at the town. Why is he looking over there, at that little blue Victorian house? Stan notes a plastic woman in the window, then turns her a little, so she's gazing out, over at the railroad bridge, actually. Suddenly, Stan has made a love story. Oh, why can't they be together? If only little Jack would just go home, to his wife, to Linda. What did Stan, the artist, just do? Well, first, surveying his little domain, he noticed which way his hobo was looking. Then he chose to change that little universe by turning the plastic woman. Now, Stan didn't exactly decide to turn her. It might be more accurate to say that it occurred to him to do so in a split second with no accompanying language, except maybe a very quiet internal yes. He just liked it better that way, for reasons he couldn't articulate, and before he'd had the time or inclination to articulate them. In my view, all art begins in that instant of intuitive preference. This is what we're getting at, like in the sense of you made these 90 thumbnails. You ran out of ideas fast. And most of your ideas were repeated. maybe one student got lucky and had a new idea. This time around, that was not the case for my courses. I've seen everything they've made before. But this question of, so how do we get better at exploration, and how do we find more interesting ideas, and how do we wow people even with little things like squares? That's what I think Saunders is getting at. We do not function well without boundaries, without limitations, without material to work with, to push against. It's kind of like opponent processing. If you want to move your hand steadily, it's very hard to do it. But if you just push against your hand, you can move incredibly smoothly across the space because I'm pushing. If you have something to push against, you can actually oftentimes get a more interesting response. And especially in the realm of creativity, if you've got something to work with, if you've got, you're doing a branding for a company, and they've got a whole history of logos over the last 40 years. And on top of that, they've got, marketing schemes and different mission statements, all these things to mine. They're little seeds. They're that model railroad in the basement that if you look through the realm, if you look through the land that is in front of you, you might find that little thing that, hey, if we start twisting this, like suddenly something new erupts. And that's why I make them draw from a bug, is because the things we find in nature are so much more interesting than the initial ideas in our minds. If I tell them to, draw, if I just told them to draw something interesting, I would end up with, like, maybe some of the art students would make some interesting drawings. But as you know, like, especially with freshmen and younger students, like, you're going to get a lot of anime. You're going to get a lot of emo, teenage angst and love, the things that they care about that are important at that stage in their lives. That's not to say that those things can't be used for interesting design or art, but they most often aren't. And I don't think it's necessarily a problem that they aren't. I think that it's very hard to use or to work within a cliche realm. It's easier to work within a specific and, like, nuanced realm to find something new and interesting to get our attention. And then you might find the job is, how do we relate this really specific thing in a more general way? So that's what day 3 is largely wrestling with and exploring those notions through those 2 activities. If you're coming along with me, I hope you're enjoying this. I hope it's clear that I love studio classes. I come alive for them, even when I have some frustrating students, which definitely it's a challenge then. But that activity of seeing students work with these things and engage in the process, it's through engaging in that creative practice that they then actually become more creative. It's not through me giving them a specific set of information. In fact, the steps are an abstraction. They're not really that. That's an oversimplification of what's happening. We're constantly going back and forth, but to engage in this process and to trust in the process, you have to taste and see that the process works before you can, like, define it or something like that. All right. I'll see you in a few days.